Welcome to Shudder Sunday Episode 2. I'm going to be telling you the story of Dennis Nilsen. Dennis Nilsen remains one of the UK's most prolific serial killers, whose victims were arguably let down by a homophobic police force. Dennis murdered up to 15 young men and boys over a 5-year period from 1978 to 1983. In those years, Dennis Nilsen brought home 15 victims from London bars. He strangled and dismembered them before burying them under his floorboards, in his garden, or even burning their bodies in bonfires. But it wasn't until his neighbours called a plumber for their clogged drains in 1983 that human remains were found in the pipes. In his meagre defence, Dennis Nilsen, who was gay, claims he was sexually abused by his grandfather until he was 5 years old. He initially confessed to killing 15 young men and boys. Police searched his home, Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, and that of his previous flat in Cricklewood, North London. They found human organs and torsos in black bin liners and a severed human head in the kitchen. Authorities recovered 11 bodies in total. Sadly, only 8 of Dennis Nilsen's 15 victims have been officially identified. The youngest of Dennis Nilsen's victims was only 14. Stephen Holmes, 14, was killed December the 30th, 1978. He was just 14 when he met the killer in a pub. Dennis invited Stephen back to his house before killing him. Nielsen kept his body in his flat for several months and even slept beside it. Kenneth Oakenden, 23, was killed December the 3rd, 1979. Kenneth was a Canadian tourist who spent the day sightseeing with Dennis Nilsen in 1979. They met in a pub before ending up at Dennis Nilsen's flat for dinner and more drinks. He was one of only a few of Dennis's victims who was reported as a missing person. Killer Dennis strangled him with the lead of a set of headphones as he listened to a record. William Sutherland, 26, was killed August 20th, 1980. He was from Edinburgh and was only 26 when he met the man who would kill him. The victim met Nielsen in a pub in Piccadilly Circus and the pair returned to the killer's flat. Dennis strangled William to death at his Melrose Avenue address in Cricklewood. Martin Duffy, 16, was killed May 17th, 1980. Homeless Martin was just 16 when he accepted Nielsen's invitation to stay the night at his house. It was the last thing he ever did. Dennis killed him by strangulation and drowning him in the kitchen sink. 2 days later, Dennis buried him beneath the floorboards at his home. Malcolm Barlow, 23, killed September 18th, 1981, was an epileptic orphan and he had spent much of his life in care. Dennis had helped the young man to get medical help when he suffered a seizure, but when Malcolm went back to Dennis's home to thank him, he was murdered and dissected. John Howlett, 23, was killed March 1982. John had met the killer in a pub near Leicester Square before returning to his flat. Dennis strangled John and drowned him in the bath. He then dismembered his body and flushed various organs down the toilet. Graham Allen, 27, was killed September 1982. Tourist Graham was lost in London when he bumped into Dennis. The killer invited him back to his flat for dinner and subsequently killed him. Dennis strangled Graham with a ligature as he ate an omelette that Dennis had cooked for him. Stephen Sinclair, 20, was killed January 26, 1983. Heroin addict Stephen was Nielsen's final victim. They met on Oxford Street, where Dennis brought him a meal before taking him home with him. Dennis strangled him to death with a ligature. After his capture, Nielsen pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. His defense argued that he was insane. A judge eventually found him guilty of 6 counts of murders and 2 of attempted murder. He was sentenced to life in prison in November 1983. Dennis served 34 years of his sentence before he died at the age of 72 in prison. Here are some more photos we're going to go through while I tell you about some of the unidentified victims. The unidentified victim was killed September 1980. Nielsen could only remember about his 5th victim was that he was an Irish labourer with rough hands, who wore an old jacket and suit. He was estimated to be between 27 and 30 years old. He had met his victim in the Cricklewood Arms in the late 1980s. Nielsen's 6th victim was described by the monster as a slender male prostitute. He said he was aged between 20 and 30 and of either Filipino or Mexican descent. Nielsen met his victim in the Salisbury Arms in October 1980. Another unidentified victim was killed November 1980. The victim was described by Nielsen as being an English vagrant in his 20s, whom he encountered sleeping in a doorway at the top of Charing Cross Road. Nielsen, who killed the man at his Melrose Avenue address, said he believed this victim's life had been one of long suffering. Nielsen commented that killing him had been as easy as taking candy from a baby. Another victim that was killed in 1980 was a long-haired hippie, aged between 25 and 30. Nielsen met him in the West End after the pubs had closed. The victim's body was retained beneath the floorboards of the flat until Nielsen removed the corpse, cut it into 3 pieces, and then returned them under the floorboards. He burnt the remains 1 year later. Nielsen's 9th victim was described as an 18-year-old blue-eyed Scot who wore a green tracksuit top and trainers. Nielsen met him in the Golden Lion pub in Soho in early January 1981. He was murdered after taking part in a drinking contest with Nielsen at Melrose Avenue. This particular unidentified victim Nielsen did not recall much about, other than the fact that he was originally from Belfast and was in his early 20s. They met somewhere in the West End after the pubs had closed. The victim was strangled with a necktie and his body before being placed beneath Nielsen's floorboards. Nielsen met his next victim, an English skinhead aged approximately 20 years, at a food stall in Leicester Square in April 1981. He was lured to Nielsen's home with the promise of a meal and some alcohol. Nielsen hung this victim's naked torso in his bedroom for 24 hours before placing the body beneath the floorboards. Nielsen later claimed to have fabricated this victim. Carl Stoter was a survivor. Aged 21 in May 1982, the drag artist met Nielsen, who invited him back for a drink. While sleeping, Nielsen attempted to strangle Carl using a zip from his sleeping bag. Carl woke up, lost consciousness, and awoke again to find himself being held underwater. Nielsen had a change of heart, it seems, as he reportedly stopped trying to drown Carl, who had lost consciousness again. He gave him mouth-to-mouth, wrapped him in sheets, and placed him in front of a heater. After regaining consciousness, Nielsen spared him and let him go. Carl said, "The thought that went through my mind was, you are drowning, you are being murdered by this man, and this is what it feels like, and you're going to die. And I thought I was dying." Nielsen helped Stoter to a tube station and he escaped. Carl went straight to the hospital where he was treated for his injuries. In 2014, Carl was found dead at his home in Brighton after falling into a diabetic coma. He had struggled with alcoholism ever since Nielsen's trial. It was Carl that helped to convict the killer to life in prison. Thanks for watching Shudder Sunday Episode 2. Feel free to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more shuddering stories.